Hello everyone, this is Lala, and today I'm going to rank the casts of Big Brother Canada. I rewatched the entire franchise last year, not including Big Brother Canada 8, for obvious reasons, and I made my commentary on those seasons in past videos where you could all watch. I was planning on making this a long video where I'm ranking the seasons and creating these season rankings based on 5 or 6 categories, and the casts are one of them. But I feel like I talked about the casts and I wrote notes about the casts more thoroughly where I could create my own video on just the cast. So that is what I'm going to do. So I'm basing this off of how well the casts gelled or didn't gel together, what each person brought to their casts, and whether they're dynamic or interesting personalities, and all that jazz. So at 10th, unsurprisingly, is the cast of Big Brother Canada 7. When you look at the cast, there really are not many notable people on it. Of course, there are the pretty boys who pretty much dominated the season. Mark did the least on the season as a player out of the bunch and was not interesting as a character at all on his own, as he came off as creepy more than anything. Dane is a very good player and really dominated the season, but as a character and personality, he didn't really offer a whole lot, and it's kind of forgettable compared to the other two pretty boys that I haven't discussed yet. Adam and Anthony are the only two ones who had a great mix of gameplay and dynamic personalities, which is why I think those two are the ones that are hugely remembered and talked about today, 5 years later. Samantha was the only woman who was interesting as she had a dynamic personality and she had an interesting journey throughout the season where her showmance with Adam caused a lot of drama as well. Outside of them, I think everyone else is a complete dud in the season. A lot of the pre-jurors are painfully forgettable, like Laura, Eddie, Kiara, and even some of the jurors are forgettable, like Corey, Estefania, and Damien. Kyra was the first non binary person to ever be a part of Big Brother, but they were just very cringe and uncomfortable to watch, where their contribution was kind of a negative. Mackie, Kaylin, and Chelsea could have potentially been interesting had they lasted longer, but they're easy to forget once you're not watching the show, and they were cut very soon, so I can't even be too highly on them, even though they aren't on par with the duds that I've mentioned in the pre-jury and the jury, were the people who made it to those two portions of the season. In general, this cast just really did not mesh well together, and it says a lot that over half of the cast is painfully forgettable. So at ninth is Big Brother Canada 11, pertaining to cast. So I don't know whether this cast is closer to being the worst one over BB Can 7, but it's very close, and I could easily have an argument for placing this as last. The BB Can 7 cast had live feeds to help them, but at the same time, they had live feeds and were still boring as fuck. But BB Can 11 didn't have live feeds and seemingly were a bit more interesting from what we saw on the episodes. On one end, it caused us to not know the cast and to get really attached to them, but at the same time, we saw on the edit that their more interesting moments were put on the show, and they probably had more interesting moments that didn't make it on the show, but would have been on the feeds. So, easily, the strongest casting choice of the season is Kuzi, who offered a lot pertaining to the gameplay, drama, personality, narration, and the spirit of the season, as well as Santina, where there is no one like her that's ever been cast, and chaos follows her everywhere she went, while having a very interesting arc. Ty and Zach aren't likable people, but they offered a lot when it came to the gameplay and drama of the season. A lot of the cast are extremely forgettable though. Pre-jurors like Amal, John, Michael, Roberto, and Vanessa really don't offer much to the season, and you will forget about them in the blink of an eye. Though they potentially had more personality than what we saw of them, especially with Amal and Vanessa. Even jurors like Dan, Jonathan, Shania, and Anika don't offer much to the show or the game, though they probably would have benefited from live feeds, since people in their archetypes usually are a bit more liked based on what we see on the live feeds. Or at least Jonathan, Shania, and Anika would have. Dan, I can't really say that at all. Claudia herself isn't really memorable, but it's her showmance is what causes her to be a bit more memorable, though she herself wasn't interesting. And Renee could have been a favorite kooky mess, but there were no live feeds, and she was easily overshadowed by people like Kuzi and Santina in that regard. Daniel played a solid game, but had some personality as well. But in general, he's just someone who generally would benefit from the feeds, since he was not the most prominent on the edit, and we would have understood the intricacies of his game a lot more, and I don't think they showed a whole lot of his personality on the episodes. In general, there really isn't anything else to say, and while the dynamics could have been interesting, the lack of attachment to them is a huge problem, especially with some of them not having much shown on the edit. So at 8, pertaining to the cast, is Big Brother Canada 4. BB Can 4 has by far the most unlikable cast out of all the seasons, and it's not even close. Despite them being unlikable, I don't think it's the weakest cast, since a lot of them did contribute to the season, and it did lead to an interesting dynamic. I'm just going to say from the jump, a good amount of the pre-jurors are very forgettable and didn't add anything to the season, like Paige, Shari, and Christine. Dallas was very gross on the live feeds, but his presence did cause people to really freak out, and he could be entertaining at moments while not overstaying his welcome. And Lovrita added a much needed presence pertaining to the drama and the strategy of the season, even though everything she did failed, and she pissed everyone off, while not overstaying her welcome, since she was starting to get old. Mitchell is someone who offered so much to the strategy of the season and was a major component of the three alliance dynamic of the season, but he did not get much of an edit until his downfall week, where he was very entertaining, but I couldn't really say that he was consistently entertaining just based on what we saw of him on the episodes, though he was more entertaining on the feeds. Raul was a bordering on being a dud, but he was also someone who was very easy to laugh at, and he had his moments that definitely brought something to the season. Maddie and Jared were both very unlikable, despite being on opposite sides of the house, but offered a lot to the season pertaining to the drama they caused. Jared was the strategic leader of their alliance for a while, or his alliance, and Maddie made so many personal moves throughout the season. Nikki and Tim offered a lot of the comedic relief to the season and brought some much needed likability, where there wasn't a whole lot of with the cast. Joel was a decently likable presence, though he is one of the more forgettable people, especially once you're not immediately watching the season. It's very easy to kind of just forget about him. And Kelsey and the Paquette brothers were irritating, though Kelsey has her moments of being somewhat endearing, while the brothers were just annoying, but I don't know if they were duds. Cassandra is easily the star of the season, as she brought a lot of humor, drama, and gameplay, while being one of the few people who seemed like she was actually having fun throughout the season. So while this season didn't have a lot of likable personalities, there are a few people who really took over that element of the season, and this was the first season I recall that really had a three alliance dynamic that held up for a majority of the season, and there were a lot of interesting dynamics through the season, which makes up for it compared to BB Can 11 and BB Can 7. So at 7th is the cast of Big Brother Canada 6. I'm honestly kind of shocked that this cast is this low on the list, though the season is a really weird one when it comes to the casting. The women are some of the strongest, most polarizing women ever on the Canadian series regarding to what they contribute, and the men are some of the weakest and least polarizing men on the Canadian version as well. On one end of the spectrum, you have Fresh Boot Rosina, who's one of the most unique people ever. Veronica definitely was a messy personality during her short time on the season. Erica is a mix of personality and being a comp beast while being rootable. Alejandra and Olivia made for a great dynamic duo throughout the season, and I even appreciate them individually. And do I even need to get into Kayla and Paris being utterly dynamic? Maddie is arguably the only female dud, though I think she would be a standout on a lot of other seasons, so it's just the competition that she is around. Regarding the guys, Andrew didn't get a lot to do, though even if he lasted longer, I don't think he would have been very interesting. Jesse only became somewhat interesting during his last few days in the season, but didn't do much in the first 2.5 weeks of the season, though he most likely probably had more personality than his main ally. Hamza definitely had personality, but also came off as way too cringe, and with the way he was shoved in our faces during the edit, really didn't do him any favors. Marin was an outright dud, despite being a very nice person who I'm sure is lovely in real life. Ryan had his loner arc, but I don't know if I call him a huge win in the casting department. Will was extremely cringeworthy, and it's ironic because it was clear he was supposed to be in the John archetype of being very likable, which so didn't come across well. Derek is a typical boring showman's mate who learned the game as he went along, and while he had some interesting moments during the latter parts of the season, it was mainly due to his dynamic with other people, rather than him on his own being dynamic or interesting. Johnny is arguably the only outright hit with the men on the casting point of view, as he reveled in being a villain and played the game while having a whole lot of personality and just having fun with it, but he barely got an edit on the season, where he was ignored for like the first 5 or 6 weeks of the season, and then he became a lot more prominent in his latter few weeks. And of course, with the inaccurate editing of the season that is infamous now, and a lot of the dynamics not being covered, the best of this cast wasn't even shown on the show, so they suffer from that as well. So at sixth is the cast of BB Can 3. I'm going back and forth between this season and another season regarding whether it should be sixth or fifth, but I'm deciding with BB Can 3 right now, and there's a huge gap between this season and the other 4 seasons pertaining the casts. One of the reasons why I chose this season instead of the other season is that it has a 16-player cast, and I still have less of an opinion on this cast compared to the other, which has a shorter cast. Risha and Neha seemed like solid casting choices, but neither one of them had much to do before they were cut early in the season. Craig is the very typical type of person in his archetype regarding what he brings, but I do find him to be a more boring version of his archetype, if that makes sense. Johnny came off as very cringeworthy on the edit and didn't add much to the season, and on the feeds, he was very quiet. So he was either very quiet and not doing anything, or very cringeworthy and doing too much on the edit. Jordan, of course, had his great rise and fall, which has become a very iconic BB Can moment, even though he was trying too hard to be a rapper on the feeds. By rapper, I mean RHAP, per, which he eventually accomplished, but it was too much for him once it became a reality. Kevin got a very overinflated edit for little reason, though you can tell that he was a production pet, but I was always neutral at best on him regarding his personality and what he brought to the season in reality. Bobby and Willow did not contribute much to the season and are pretty forgettable in the grand scheme of things. Cindy is very dynamic and chaotic, who made the most of her limited time on the season, so she is definitely a standout. Bruno did have his moments throughout the season that are memorable, especially the triple, so while he isn't the most interesting, I can't say he's a dud compared to many others. I think it's so laughable that Zach, of all people, became the big villain of the season. Though he's just a normal ass guy, though he still falls under the quote unquote generic hunky good player archetype. Polar was a dud who offered nothing to the season, and Ashley was very similar until her underdog arc during the final 2 weeks of the season. Brittany and Sarah were rootable underdogs, though Brittany came off as contrived at times in the diary room. And Sarah is such a unique person and brought a lot of levity and likability to the season, while also being very dramatic and having interesting gameplay, I'll just put it that way. There was literally no one like Godfrey, and he brought much needed life to the season, though he started the annoying speech trend, which thankfully died out in the more recent seasons. I think the cast, being all superfans, definitely did not help, since they were not the most dynamic, but they did gel well enough together. Though the twists, unfortunately, hampered the cast and the dynamics that could have resulted had they just let them play the game on a simple matter and let them really do what they wanted to do with all the cut-through moves and all that jazz. So at fifth is the cast of Big Brother Canada 1, the one that started it all. So, yes, I was debating about whether to put this season and Big Brother Canada 3 in the opposite positions. So, I have a very interesting relationship with this cast, pertaining my viewing journey. When the series first started, I thought it was a very strong cast, and many of them contributed to the season. But with the show continuing on through many seasons, and this season being over a decade old at this point, I don't really feel the same anymore. Kat and Danielle didn't get much to do on their short times on the season, while Anil and Liza were definitely gamers and seemed a bit messy. Nothing really came to fruition, and they became somewhat forgettable, at least for their in-game antics and for how they were on the actual edit. Tom was a notable pre-Jorah villain in BB Can, so I can't say he was a dud at all, as he pretty much offered what everyone expected that he was going to offer. Suzette had a few moments during the season and is very unique, but even she got boring after a while. AJ was a dad who contributed absolutely nothing during the season, and I didn't find him funny whatsoever. Topaz had a lot of moments that are still very memorable today, and she is definitely an iconic player. The Shield were very infuriating and irritating, but I would be lying if I said that they didn't contribute a lot to the season, even if it was negative and dated, so they unfortunately were not duds. Andrew was decent and had his moments in the season, so while he isn't a dud, he's very forgettable in the grand scheme of things. So he's kind of similar to Joel from BB Can 4 in that element. Tyler was great comic relief, especially during the second half of the season, though it's easy to see why her successes are more remembered now. Emmett is definitely the attractive gamebot who dominated the season, but he is more arrogant, dramatic, and hot-headed than I remembered compared to the first time I watched the season, so I can't even really say that he's a dud. And Jillian definitely had her fiery moments throughout the season, though nothing compared to the Amazing Race, but even she pales in comparison to some of her cast members. What do I even really need to say about Gary? He was the star of Big Brother Canada for several years, and he's still one of the most remembered people from the season or the series overall. But he brought competition, drama, personality, and there's still absolutely no one like him. Overall, the cast had some great casting choices, some duds, and some forgettable people, even if they themselves were not duds. Though the dynamics weren't the strongest, which I have to admit now, so it is a mixed bag. And I also think I thought the season's cast was much stronger at the time because it was sandwiched between a lot of not great Big Brother US seasons and casts. So it definitely came off as positive compared to then. But once I'm solely comparing it to the other BB Can seasons, the cast definitely lacks in comparison. So, at fourth pertaining, the cast is Big Brother Canada 5, and I'm honestly kind of shocked since I would have thought that this cast would have been higher. So, looking at the top four, it was pretty hard to choose which season to cut, but then one stood out a lot more to me, and it was this season that was the obvious outlier, and it's mainly due to the newbies. Mark is a pretty memorable first boot, but I don't know if he would have been interesting had he lasted longer. Emily made it halfway throughout the season and really didn't contribute anything to the season, and she herself was very boring and didn't offer anything as a game player either. Jackie was definitely a character, though a lot of her loner storyline just led to her whining and playing a victim, which got old. William and Dre had a great dynamic throughout the season and had some good moments, though Dre definitely brought a lot more in comparison to William. Dylan made it to the final five, and I really do not remember much about him, since he wasn't a villain, but wasn't a hero either, and wasn't interesting as a game player. Dimitri was arguably the only newbie who could keep up with the veterans, and while he is likable, I don't know how much of his contribution as a character and even a player was due to him on his own, or mainly his showman, if that makes sense. Karen is definitely reality TV gold, and is definitely the standout newbie in entertainment, though she really offered nothing in the game as a player. It's clear that the veterans were stronger than the newbies when it comes to the casting, though even some of them weren't that interesting this time around. Dallas had his fiery moments during the little time he was on the season, but it's also very easy to forget about him. Cassandra definitely had a fall from grace this season, but she was one of the few who seemed like she was having a good time, though she was definitely putting on a performance pertaining what she thought people liked from her in her last season. Gary seemed more mature this season, and I would have liked to see how he would have continued had he lasted longer. Neda definitely brought it in the season, though Neda became more villainous, mainly in the edit, though she really wasn't that different from her prior season, pertaining her actions. Cindy is a weird case of being a dud for most of the season, as she was literally the most invisible person for the first 5 weeks, to being part of the most memorable moment of the season, with sending Neda home. Bruno was nowhere near as notable as he was in BB Can 3, and Kevin really only came into large focus after Bruno was booted, since he had to win his way to the end. But some could say he was likable, while others could say he was irritating, as he suffered from the same issues as BB Can 3 with the bloated edit. Aika is easily the standout of the season, whether you like her or dislike her. She massively improved from her abysmal performance to becoming a great game player this season and really brought a lot of the chaos and intrigue into the season. While there are a lot of good and decent people from a casting standpoint, and the dynamics were mostly good, some of the faults that come from the newbies versus veterans dynamic holds this cast back, with a lot of the newbies being easily overshadowed by the veterans, and a lot of the veterans not being anywhere near as interesting the second time around, though they're still a lot more consistent compared to the other seasons that I've already discussed. So, at third, the bronze prize goes to the cast of Big Brother Canada 10. For some reason, I wasn't expecting the season to make it this high when I was looking into the cast of each season, but I might have benefited by the others being a bit weaker. So, Melina offered absolutely nothing. Jay didn't get a chance to really do much during the short time they were there. Stephanie did have that fight in her last week and could have been more fiery had she not been blindsided early, and Tanisha really didn't stand out much at all during the season, so she was kind of a dud. Cal was definitely a train wreck during his last 2 weeks in the house, and it did bring some life into the pre-jury, though the first 2 weeks he really wasn't that notable either. So he was kind of interesting somewhat by accident, if that makes sense. Jess did have a very interesting run, with being an outcast at first to getting into a decent enough position, only to blow up their game with winning HOH and picking random fights with people while just being very weird and off. Herman and Moose are both good casting choices, with the former trying and failing to be Derek, but it's just too messy and it's also just too unadaptable to really pull off anything. And Moose in general was a complete disaster gameplay wise, and always found himself in some drama, though he never really was that messy himself or that dramatic or volatile himself. Gino was pretty boring and didn't offer much to the season, though he did win a few competitions, but he could have been boring and unlikable / insufferable, where he wasn't insufferable or unlikable, if that makes sense. Summer was a solid casting choice, and she definitely had her moments, but she was inconsistent since she sometimes did too much, especially on the edit, and did too little at various points in the season as well. Marty was insufferable and entitled, but he definitely made his mark on the season. Jason Lynn also is someone who was kind of boring throughout the season, though I think it was mainly due to her romance with Gino, but she got more interesting after he left as a player and a personality during her final week on the season. So I think she was brought down by her romance with Gino. Helena was under-edited throughout the season, but I do think she was a good casting choice, as she had her entertaining moments and thrived in the game. Betty was a huge win in the casting department, as she took everything so personally and was just so ridiculously funny to watch with how she just handled even the simplest things. I wouldn't call Josh a dud per se, but he was not one of the more interesting people on the season, as he was mainly just a normal guy. Kevin is definitely the huge casting win, or a huge casting win, as he definitely played the hell out of the game and enjoyed the hell out of it too, while also being captivating, self-aware, and entertaining, which is rare. There are a lot of wins with the casting of the season, though there are definitely some duds that hold the cast back in comparison, which is why it isn't in the top 2, but the duds in this season are nowhere near close to the duds on other seasons, if that makes sense. So the silver prize of second goes to the cast of Big Brother Canada 9. So I'm going back and forth about whether this season should be number 1 or number 2 pertaining its cast, and even after writing and recording this, my opinion could easily be changed. Julie is a pretty notable first boot who definitely had personality, though didn't have much to do. Josh was a very unique and interesting person during the 2 weeks he was there, and just the way he handled things had me mystified. Latoya really had an I don't give a fuck attitude, and the way she carried herself really intrigued me, and I liked how she played hard throughout her short time on the season. Kyle is arguably the only dud on the season, and he really didn't have much personality, and was just awkward to watch, and it makes sense why he barely got any diary rooms. Austin definitely had a princess vibe to her, but she wasn't over the top or manufactured like some others in her archetype during BB Ken. Victoria is extremely unique, as she is someone in her archetype. Victoria doesn't even really have an archetype, but she is someone who's just very entertaining, and she can be very likable, but it's also very infuriating. But she's just unapologetically herself, and made the season a lot more electric just by her presence. Rohan was a cool guy who definitely had his confrontational moments, and he had the personality to be an interesting, charismatic underdog, which is something that is very undersold on reality TV, since there are a lot of underdogs who just aren't charismatic or interesting at all. Tina is the only other person that could arguably be considered a dud, in my opinion, since she didn't have much personality, and despite high hopes, she was a dud pertaining the game as well. Jetson and Beth were chaotic and fun presences individually, but they just brought those traits out in one another even more when they were together, so they definitely made the season better. There is no one on Big Brother that is like Kiefer, where he is really likable and was a better player than expected, but he can also be really arrogant in every element where it is annoying. Tara was boring in the first half of the season, though she was trying to play aggressively and had more life than someone like Tina, but then she became her own during the second half of the season, as she really had an I don't give a fuck attitude, got herself in some drama, and really just pushed for what she wanted as a game player. And I really appreciated the fight that she had during the second half of the season. Brayden was kind of in between, as he was low key overall, but he did have some moments throughout the season. Tashawn was a chaotic mess as well, but it's overshadowed by Jetson and Beth, though he became too much of a reckless savage during the last few weeks in the season. Overall, I think this cast had a really great dynamic, which is why they're so high, as well as most of the cast offering something to their table, where it had less duds than most of the other seasons I've discussed. So at number one is the cast of Big Brother Canada 2, and it's interesting because I find the season to be a bit overrated, so I never thought that the cast would be number one. Though I'm still not really sure whether the season's cast should be number one or number two. But there's something special about this cast that definitely elevated the series overall, where the cast is definitely the main reason for that. Anik was a unique personality, though we barely saw her. Kyle is a solid casting choice who can be douchey and sweet at the same time, where it would have been interesting to see how he adapted as the season continued. Paul is a huge pre-jury flameout who called people out, overplayed to hell and back, and really gave a different perspective, but he would have been exhausting had he lasted longer in the season. Aika isn't necessarily likable, but she brought a lot of drama and intrigue during the short time she was on the season. Andrew was definitely the big villain, and while he did have his moments, I didn't find him to be as entertaining or charismatic as others in his archetype. Sarah had a few decent moments, but she was one of the tamer personalities on the show, with a tame edit if I remember correctly as well, but she probably would have been a bigger personality on another cast. Kenny was definitely an interesting personality with how he can be charismatic one moment and then be an asshole in another. And using his straight presentedness was something to talk about, I'll say that. Artie is someone that I found extremely contrived and try hard, but I don't think he was necessarily a dud, though I don't think he was able to pull off his full potential as a player. Alison might have been interesting if she was there from the very beginning, but she was kind of boring, stifled, and didn't have much to do on the season. Rochelle's dynamic with Sabrina became entertaining as the season went on, though she herself was kind of boring and not notable at all. Adele was very likable, though he could be confrontational at times and could be a bit too pandering pertaining to the Canadian audience overall. Heather was a likable person who grew into her own player and person throughout the season, though a part of me wonders if she would have been more or less notable if it wasn't for the treatment that she received in the beginning of the season. Neda is definitely the first person you think of when the season comes up, as while she definitely comes off as a gamebot at times, you could definitely tell that she has a lot of personality, was enjoying the game or enjoying playing the game, and there's definitely a more devious side to her that wasn't focused on because of the underdog position she was in throughout the first half. Sabrina is definitely a dynamic house guest, as she was an overpowering pawn for the majority and a whining train wreck when she was an underdog, but she always provided. John was the one of the more John was one of the more likable guys throughout the season, though I think he mainly benefited from his interactions with more dynamic people, though he could have been more boring than others in his archetype, so he wasn't the most boring, if that makes sense. Overall, this cast just had a really good, interesting vibe and dynamic throughout the season, though a part of it was definitely artificial due to the America's H Canada's HOH twist, but we'll get more into that once I discuss the other elements of the seasons. Alrighty, so that concludes my Big Brother Canada casts ranking, and it's pretty simple and to the point. I'm definitely looking forward to making more of these rankings throughout the season about certain elements of these Big Brother Canada seasons, and I'm definitely going to be making more content in general regarding BBUS, continuing those BB20 compilation videos, and talking about other things that don't involve Big Brother or reality TV. So be on the lookout. You can follow me on my Twitter at Lala_Annie, and I'll definitely be back with more stuff in the future. Bye!